All right. So, welcome everyone who's joining us today. I have with me Melanie Evans, speech language pathologist, who is joining me for Better Speech and Hearing Month. So,
Wow.
welcome, Melanie.
Yes, and thank you. I can't believe that it's almost over.
I know, right? It's passing slowly at the beginning, but then I feel like these last couple of weeks so quickly. There's so much going on. I'm sure you're very busy. So we do appreciate having you on here to chat with us today about dynamic assessment. But before we dive in, could you please introduce yourself for people who don't know you?
Yes, and again, Melissa, thank you for having me. So, my name is Melanie Evans. I am a Spanish bilingual speech language pathologist. I'm currently based in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but I'm also licensed in Texas and California. I do plan on doing an international trip with a program called Remote Year. So, I'll be going to a new country every single month. And my reason behind that is just because I'm all about cultural responsiveness. I love DEI and, just a quick little backstory about me. That's something that has always been my intention since I started the industry, the field. And so that's kind of it in a nutshell. I do have a podcast. I also have a YouTube channel where I get to just talk more about DEI and speech pathology. So I'm very thankful that Melissa reached out to me to be on the show today.
And we're so happy to have you. Honestly, I'm so fortunate that I'm also on, social media and I get to discover all these wonderful colleagues. I call you a colleague, even though we're not practicing together. These are my colleagues from near and far, and I get to discover all these
Hmm.
wonderful podcasts and platforms where like-minded SLPs can be found, such as you. And so, how is it? Okay, no, actually, the first thing I wanted to jump in with is that so here in Canada, the theme of the month for Better Speech and Hearing Month is communication is. So I wanted to jumpstart with you telling us in your own words, in your own definition, what communication is to you.
Okay. Communication to me, communication is connection. I think that that is like if I were to describe that in one word, communication is connection. I think that communication is also culture, how culture goes into connection and how we connect with each other by our different cultures and backgrounds.
Right. Oh, I love that. That is beautiful. That is, and it's very individual, right? And like you said, we can connect through communication various ways, right? Depending on our
Yes.
culture, our background. So that's why I reached out to you because I'm actually just new listening to your podcast. So I've been trying to like catch up on some episodes. I've listened to a few, which at the end I'll have you share where people can reach you and listen to you because you've got so much insight to share with others. So before we actually get into dynamic assessment, you mentioned just before that straight from the get-go, as you finished your studies, it was your intention to talk about cultural responsiveness. Why was this something that was of interest of you? How did this come about?
Actually, it wasn't even so much cultural responsiveness. I would say that's kind of like the umbrella. It was more so about closing the academic achievement gap. So here in the States, and I'll just kind of backtrack, in undergrad, I had experiences where I got to be a part of education reform initiatives here in
Okay.
the United States. So I got to go to New Orleans and volunteer and learn more about the initiatives there and also the disparities. I got to go to Chicago, volunteer, learn a bit about the disparities there. And so it was kind of like that track that, I like to say God just put me on this track to do it. And so the way that it became cultural responsiveness, it just kind of became a feed through for that because after George Floyd happened, which I called it, even though it wasn't a shot, but I call it like the shot heard around the world. Like everyone knew about George Floyd. And I created a post, 5 ways to support Black and Brown children in
Yeah.
clinical and education settings. And that post blew up. Like
Yeah.
for lack of better words, it went viral. And so I'm like, wow, this is actually something that people in our industry feel like they're lacking on, like they feel like they don't know enough about. So expanded from the academic achievement gap and also went into just overall how we can learn how to interact with each other, how we can learn how to communicate with each other and learn about our different communication styles so that way we can close gaps all around in our profession.
Yeah, I love this. I actually heard you mentioning on one of your episodes, and this is not something I would have thought about, how you had to travel. I think it was, could it be in Chicago? You had to travel to get to school, and you realized that for students to get to school, that just the travel to get out of the city to get to different places like universities or stores or activities was really, really difficult. And so I guess it stems, I mean, there's all these nuances and things that we don't think about that are affecting, that are creating barriers, not only for other therapists or other people who want to have access to education, higher education, but then also we think about the families that we work with and how this can affect them as well, getting access to services. I thought that was really, really interesting and really eye-opening for me, at least, to think about it in that way. I thought, oh yeah, I never thought about the commute. Well, I guess for me, yes, I think about the commute that my families may or may not have to get to me or me to get to them in order to be able to offer them services. But when you think about that, I think it can tie into the academic achievement gap, right? How do we get BIPOC people to come and join the SLP force as well and get to that training and that level? Thank you for sharing that with us, by the way. That was, anyway, so if you guys want to go and hear these stories and this breadth of information that Melanie has to share, she does have her podcast, which is called
the Pediatric Speech Sisters Show.
Yes. So I think that was an episode with Carol, I forget her name, JRCD SLP. I remember her.
Jordan, yes, with Jordan. Yes. And we both went to the same alma mater, so we have kind of the same fabric, so to speak, when it comes to these issues, these critical issues in social justice and everything.
Yeah. So like, let's tie this into dynamic assessment. What is your like experience with dynamic assessment? I know you and I spoke outside of this, and you told me this is like good timing. You're teaching right now. Is that correct?
Yes, we just wrapped up the semester. So I'm not necessarily teaching right now, but it was perfect timing because I knew that I was about to do a lecture on cultural responsive assessment. So yes.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit about who you were teaching to and what you discussed in terms of cultural responsive assessments, and how does that, which then ties into dynamic assessment, because dynamic assessment would be a culturally responsive type of assessment. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes. So in my mind, I'm thinking of it like a 1, 2, 3. So I'll talk a little bit about the background with the instruction, and then I'll talk a little bit about cultural responsive assessment, and then I'll talk about dynamic assessment specifically.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I threw a lot of questions at you. There's like a lot engulfed in there. So yeah, 1, 2, 3.
No problem. The first thing I'll say is this was actually my first year being an instructor for an undergrad course. It was actually called accent modification, but the chair has been really fighting to get it changed to cultural responsiveness and speech pathology. So I taught from the book of Dr. Yvette Heider and Dr. Salis Province called Cultural Responsiveness and Speech Pathology. So we used that book, and really the class was less about accent modification, even though we did get to have a couple lectures and modules on accent mod, but it was more so about the different cultures and the histories of different cultures and the different communication styles and how we can be better advocates for them. And so that was a very exciting class. I think the students were more so excited to learn about accent modification. I don't think they were, because they're undergrad students. So not everyone was ready to hear about the whole social justice and human rights and everything that falls into that. But, just moving on to the cultural responsive assessment, I think that it's incredibly important how speech pathologists can learn to be crucial advocates for the cultures that we are serving, because they are just like what you mentioned, some people have those long commutes that are coming from maybe rural areas or lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And then we also talk about power dynamics, how they're looking at the speech language pathologist, or we even talked about different traumas, even racial trauma or medical trauma that they might have experienced that could have created barriers to access to receiving care from a speech pathologist, or even having that educational awareness, like that health literacy, to know that it might be necessary to seek care. So these are all important to, as far as assessment goes, these are all important to know, first of all, for gathering the case history, just with any relationship at all, business, professional, platonic, romantic, you're going to want to get a diagnostic understanding of that person's background to be able to truly be your best for them and meet them where they're at, right? And so that's where my mindset is when it comes to culture responsive assessment. Now, we can of course talk about, I think that in our field, the most popular way to be culture responsive in assessment is to use the dynamic assessment model, because as we know, standardized assessments aren't standardized very well on multicultural groups, which I'm sure that we'll get into a bit. Yeah, at all. And so for myself, even as a bilingual speech language pathologist, I'll use standardized tests. I will, and that's because I work in the schools and they require us to use standardized tests. And even insurance, they want something standardized for billing and everything. But I don't let that be the only factor that will have me put someone on or off the caseload, so to speak, especially since I'm coming from a lens of the achievement gap. Because part of the achievement gap is putting children in special education. And it's kind of one of those double-edged swords. I'm sure you've heard this, there's an over and under diagnoses of children. Yeah. So it's like, oh my gosh, how do we break that? Because that's just one of those double-edged swords. So one thing I will say when dynamic assessment is involved, now there's the teach, test, reteach, or the test, teach, reteach model. Yeah. I don't know. I call that RTI, response to intervention. I was doing that. What do you think about it?
Okay, so I think there's a slight difference between the two. They resemble each other, but I feel like what I do is kind of a merge of the two. We know that like formally response to intervention is for school age children, typically when we want to prevent reading and writing disorders. So we'd go in and do a more universal screener, if you want, to see who may be at risk or who's more fragile in certain aspects of pre-reading and writing skills. But I think that dynamic assessment is closely related to RTI in the sense that it may be over a shorter period of time, but it's really giving us information dynamically as we're adapting ourselves and scaffolding to the child's level, to provide us information about how the child is responding and what types of supports this child needs. So I think they're very closely related. We could differentiate them, but RTI would be like over a longer period of time, and it's a more prescribed way of doing things. I'm not trained in RTI. I work more so with preschool, so 0 to 6. So actually the guest that I she is an SLP here in Quebec, Canada, and she has her private practice for many years. She lectures in multicultural and linguistic topics, and this is her area of interest. And so she teaches her younger clinicians and the students to do kind of an RTI where she doesn't do any assessment, or she'll try not to. She'll intervene. And then the period of intervention will differ based on what the parents are coming to get. If they need, insurance for insurance purposes or to get access to public health care, we can get certain subsidies in daycares and stuff like that over here in Quebec. So depending on the timeline, if the parent is coming and they don't quite have a timeline, but they just want to come and help their child, we may be able to take more time. So she does it kind of like this. And I thought what was interesting about that is that she first asks parents, kind of what's their timeline. And that's something that I didn't include in my process, but I'm definitely going to be including, because this RTI is key, so I kind of want to get back to what you were saying before with static or standardized testing that you have to do. So talk to us a little bit of how you would go through that and how RTI plays into that.
Well, I will say RTI because RTI was really when I was in the schools. And what I did love about RTI is that, and I will say, I'm also considering, I love that you're considering asking parents about what their timelines are. Now, I am coming from a very school-based lens. So the timeline is the state timeline. There's really we don't
What is
really,
the
nobody
timeline?
has a say in that. The state timeline, so there's the initial meeting where we determine, okay, I would, this is in Houston, because in Oklahoma, it's actually different. So in
Okay.
Houston, Texas, I asked, what are your concerns? What's showing up? It would be the teacher and the parent that would meet, and, myself. And then just depending on what they were coming up with. Sometimes the parents are like, I don't have any concerns. It's really more so the
Yeah.
teacher's things. Sometimes the teacher would be like, I really don't have any concerns. It's more so like the parents' thing. And so, just really depending on what the consensus is. And if I'm seeing anything that's alarming, that's a symptom of a delay, then yes, I'd say, okay, let's go ahead and treat, or let's go ahead and do the actual assessment. But if it's more so like, oh, this could, maybe this person or you all just moved here. So
Mm-hmm.
let's, you all just moved here from Mexico, for example. So let's try the RTI method. How about I give you some speech sounds to work on and see if this is really a disorder or just a difference. And so
Right.
that's when, really it's a gift to speech pathologists who also have really high caseloads and who are culture responsive and
Yeah.
don't want to just put everybody on their caseload, so we're able to empower the teachers and also empower the parents to have a say and play a part in the intervention process. So that's RTI in a nutshell for me. So since I've moved from Texas, I haven't been able, I'm going to call it a gift. I haven't had the gift of doing RTI. So it is more so, the parent will come and we'll say, okay, well, let's go ahead and do the assessment. And the timeline for that after the initial meeting, we have 15 days to get the signature. And then we have 45 school days to do the assessment.
Okay.
And then after the assessment, I believe we have close to 30 calendar school days to have like the initial meeting to determine if they if they've qualified or not. So that's it in a nutshell. Now I since I haven't been doing RTI, I'm really interested in my dynamic assessment is more so like holistic assessment. So
Yeah.
not the test teach retest model, but more so the, okay, yes, we have the standardized test, great, we have kind of an understanding of where they're at
Is that a
standardized
starting
wise.
point for you?
No, actually, the starting point is the interview with the parent and also my observation. Yeah, definitely the interview with the parent. Okay, what's coming up at home? How many languages are spoken at home? What's the percentage of each language spoken at home if they do have another language? Talking to their teachers, how are they presenting in class? I'll do the classroom observation to see how they're interacting with their peers. And
Yeah.
then I'll do the standardized test. One, because it's required, and two, because standardized tests they still give really great information. How quickly the child answers, what he, just over, and also just gives me a sense of the child's personality and how he or she or they approach test taking.
Right.
Because a lot of times children, even as you work with toddlers, and I remember I had a 4-year-old who was great. I mean, he was a great kid. Really, he was sitting down and he was psycholalic and everything, but at the same time you could tell he was really nervous, and so he wasn't giving me everything that I needed. We did the PLS, no, we did the self preschool. And so what I did was I asked for a play-based sample from his mom, and that's where he gave me all the language I needed for that language sample. One thing I will say that I don't waver on, even when I'm tempted to, because I already know there's actually research about language samples and speech
Yeah.
pathologists kind of skipping that part because it can be very time consuming. I'm sure it's the
Don't
same
ever
in
skip
Canada,
it.
but don't skip it, and it makes sense. It makes sense why you'd want to skip it, but you get so much from the language sample. And it also just strengthens the report. It strengthens the rationale for why you are putting them, I always say putting them on the caseload. I want to find a better way to say that. But while you're qualifying them or disqualifying them, it just builds a better case. And so I've had cases of bilingual kiddos, for example, a 2-year-old who was turning 3, and her mom was concerned because she was speaking in jargon, and so even in Spanish she really, even her mom didn't know what she was saying, and then I didn't know what she was saying either. At the same time, she wasn't having any other challenges, and her standardized test scores when we tested her in both English and Spanish, they came out moderately below average, and so, or mildly below average. I think she was in
Right.
the 80s. And in Oklahoma, you have to be a 77 or below on the
Okay.
standardized score. to qualify. And so we just simply could not qualify her, and we weren't going to fight it. And so I think another thing I'll mention this is that as speech pathologists, we're kind of afraid of what the parent might say. We're kind of afraid of maybe like getting sued. I don't know. We kind of think of the worst case scenario. So we don't want to not qualify the kid if the
Right.
parent is coming to us. But you know what I found, the times where I decided not to qualify the child, the parents said, okay, you know, we just wanted to cross our boxes and just make sure everything was good, and it's fine.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay, I see a difference here in, practices a little bit in the US and here, because here for school age children, I guess, are those qualifications to receive services in school?
In the schools.
Okay. Here, yeah, at the government level, I guess, I think some scores are needed, but I think SLPs are able to justify putting the scores, but not using them, not using the percentiles,
Right.
for example, in certain cases. But again, it differs from place to place. So yeah, some will use test scores and then complement with other things. I want to just go back on something you said before. Is it really easy to skip over a language sample? Because I feel like maybe this is something we need to point at more. Because for me, it is probably other than the ethno-linguistic interview, like creating that connection with the parent, getting that information, but taking the time to discuss things with them and showing them that I'm genuinely interested in their story, their background, but then getting a proper or multiple language samples, maybe a home language sample, and then a language sample with me, where then I do dynamic assessment in there. That is probably one of the most important things that I do. And so for me, it would be, if I would say, here are the two things that you can't gloss over, you can't skip over it, do a proper parent interview. Don't just send them a form. Take the time to talk to them, take the time to gather the information, and get a good language sample. What do you think about that?
Are you in the schools?
I am working with preschoolers. So just to get back to the tests,
Okay.
I actually completely stopped using any standardized testing, unless this morning I had a monolingual, which happens rarely now, French speaking child, because over here the majority language is French. And so I assessed him with a standardized French articulation test, and I'll probably use the scores. But even at that, I did dynamic assessment with him to see how he was responding to if he was stimulable for certain sounds that were still age appropriate that he doesn't have yet, but he was super stimulable. He was able to, repeat the models, and even later, a little bit delayed imitation, he like used that sound that we have in French spontaneously. I was like, wow, okay. So I told the mom, I said, it's age appropriate that he's not producing them yet, but if you'd like, we could work on them. He's super stimulable. He's ready. He can discriminate. So I don't use any standardized testing with preschoolers. I'll do language sampling. So maybe that's where it becomes really long, if you're doing all these standardized tests in one language, in another language, and then you want to go in and get more information. So what would you, if you had advice to give to your peers? I'm thinking particularly about my monolingual peers who are French speaking over here. And they're like, no, I can't take many will take English speaking children, maybe when they're younger, not when they're older, because they won't feel comfortable. But English, French aside, which are more majority Canadian languages, if we have kids from other backgrounds, they're not feeling like they can do it. Right. So what would you give as advice to someone who has a child coming on their caseload and they're like, I don't feel like I have the tools or the means to assess this child? What would you?
Two things are coming to my mind. So I do speak about this. I had a conversation with, her name is Jermaine Graham, and she specializes in deaf and hard of hearing. We kind of talked about, she's in private practice. And so we talked about, if you're a speech pathologist who completely feels incompetent when treating, testing deaf and hard of hearing children, families, what should you do? And she says you should refer. Well, in the schools, we don't have that luxury. We don't have that luxury to really refer. We just don't. So the two things I will say, if you do have that luxury, if you're in a private practice setting or maybe another setting that is a bit more lenient, refer. The other thing I would say is to get excited about it. Okay, so I have a new case. I have an English speaking child. Yes, or student, yes, I'm feeling like an imposter. I'm feeling like I'm not capable of doing this. I haven't done it in a while. Whatever stories that our mind starts telling us on why we're incapable of doing this, even though we might be one of the most capable ones because we're qualified in the field, right? So take it as a really fun, exciting learning opportunity and a fun collaboration opportunity. So what I mean by that is there's a child, because when we also, as you know, of course, when we think of diversity, I'm thinking about disability diversity as well. And
Yeah.
so I had a student who needed an eye gaze device, which unfortunately they were kind of tugging her around with that eye gaze device. We only got
Oh,
to use it a couple times in our sessions.
okay.
Yeah. But she was wheelchair bound and I was not comfortable. I was not comfortable. Now I was in the school, so I could have, and actually I was contracted with a teletherapy company. So I could have said, hey, someone else who might be a bit more comfortable or qualified do this. But
Right.
I took it as a challenge. And what I did though was I reached out to a colleague who loves this stuff, who's like AAC, everything, eye gaze, everything, that's her ideal dream population. Different company. So it's not like I could say, hey, could you treat this child? Very different company. But I was able to gain resources from them and
Yeah.
use them. And then that's what builds my competency.
Yeah.
And so that's why I always like to preach cultural competency as a journey, not a destination. And so if
Absolutely.
you do plan on, if you plan to be in this field for a long time until retirement, if you plan to be in this field for 20 plus years, then I think the best option is to grow, rather than choose the self-doubt, I can't do it option.
Yeah.
But I also want to show grace. Trust me, I do want to show grace. Even as a Spanish bilingual speech linguist pathologist, I get Spanish cases and I start sweating. I remember I had a Cuban Spanish client. I was taught in Guatemalan Spanish. And so, I met with them and again, it was just a fun learning opportunity. I'm like, okay, so there are some words that I do not know in Cuban Spanish. So let me go ahead and do some more teaching. Let me also drop my pride, which is the cultural humility piece, and
Yeah.
ask the parent, how do you say this in Cuban Spanish? Is it the same word in Spanish? So yes, no, trust me, I was sweating the first 3 sessions.
Yeah.
but by the time you start building that rapport, it's okay. And everyone's just happy that the services are being met.
Right. But I love that you said that, to just have that humility to say, I don't know. I think that's a really important part of our job in general, is to be, because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I remember in my younger years, I've been practicing now for 13 years, and I would get questions from parents who were, maybe doctors or researchers, and they would ask me very pointed questions about the tests that I was using. And boy, I was sweating. Or they would ask me, and it's
Yeah.
okay to say, I don't know, I'll get back to you, in terms of like knowledge, us being a knowledge base. And it's okay also
Mm-hmm.
to say, I don't know, can you help me with this? Thinking about our, multicultural, multilinguistic families we work with, particularly the example you gave with different dialects, which will vary from region to region. And that's part of the dynamic assessment as well, right? Is working with families in partnership. That's a huge part of it. Do you find that you get to do a lot of that in the schools? Do parents in the US, how is it like over here? I feel like school-based SLPs find it harder to access families because the kids are already in school, right? So you're just going to pluck them
Mm-hmm.
out of class after the initial meeting, potentially. You just have access to the child, but you may not so easily have access to the families. Would you say it's the same in Oklahoma or in Houston?
Yep. In the States, there's kind of almost like a culture to it. And one thing that frustrated me as a clinical fellow is I felt, even when I was in my clinical fellowship, and when you're fresh out, you're bright-eyed and like, yay, I'm ready to try everything. And oh, everything's all
Absolutely.
flowers and daisies. And then you get into it, and it's, you have to realize your expectations had to change, right? So I got into it and I realized, oh, this is a very well-oiled machine. So my mindset was to help close the academic achievement gap, but it's hard to do that when I'm in the system because it's a very systematic process, systematic thing. And so just to answer your question about being able to really talk to the parents, our caseload our caseloads here are super high. And so I think it's very normal, like, which I've just seen amongst colleagues. And again, I will say I've been very tempted to do this myself, just to send the parent, like what you said, don't just send the parent the questionnaire, just to send the parent the questionnaire for
Right.
sure. Just send it to them, because you also have, so it's almost like that's their way of collaborating, which isn't, I'm not going to say that's a bad thing, but you also do miss out on the opportunity to really walk through the questions with the parent, because they're not speech pathologists. They might not know, and you might need to ask follow-up questions. There's something else that you said that I wanted to touch on. I like how you think about it like in a collaborative sense. And I'm the same way. So I use the example of the parent who's Cuban, and I'm asking them, how do you say this word? So we're in a collaborative process. But even on the assessment portion, just really making decisions and trusting that that parent also knows something, and treating that parent as an expert in their home. And so you mentioned like medical and or doctors and researcher parents asking you like those specific questions, right? And it's scary, because it's like, oh my gosh, I don't want to come off as incompetent if I don't know this. And at the same time, I think that parents specifically are they'll have much more respect for you if you are willing to, and I'm just speaking in general, but if you are willing to humble yourself and say, you know what, I do not know that. Can you tell me a bit more about that? Especially just specifically medical doctors and researchers, because we're trained in a specific area, but if they give us an opportunity to expand our view, then that's great too.
Yeah, agreed. 100%. And that's on one end of the spectrum. Working with, I think, multicultural families often, because I do an interview with them. And so I make sure to let them know that certain questions I'm asking, because sometimes I'll dig a little bit deeper into we have a lot of new immigrants that come to Canada often, a lot of families coming from everywhere, sometimes coming from a difficult situation. We have refugees. All that needs to be considered, right, when we're assessing. And so when I'm asking them questions, I want to make sure that I'm letting them know that this may seem a little weird, like, hey, I came here for my child. Why are you asking me about my immigration or where I'm from, and, what languages I speak and how I interact with these languages, with who, and all of this. And I let them know that all of this helps me get a better understanding of who they are and kind of like how they function in their day to day and where they're coming from, so that I can best help the child and really see, do we have real difficulties here? Is it more so of a language difference?
Right. And I do appreciate you saying that, because I think about just sociocultural factors,
Yeah,
that could impact communication. Maybe the child really is genuinely just shy. But of
absolutely.
course, the parent is concerned that they're not speaking. But I'm like, well, if they just moved here, or maybe they have a lot of siblings at home, so
Yeah.
they don't feel like they can use their voice. It might not actually be a language disorder or delay. They're just shy. So there have been times. I think that's another great part about culture responsive assessment and assessment in general, is
Yeah.
the interprofessional practice, is cluing in like a psychologist, or at least being knowledgeable about trauma-informed care is huge, especially for culturally diverse clients.
Absolutely. Which is probably something I want to delve more into. I've had a lot of kids come, like you said, they've just changed countries. Coming to Canada is difficult, especially if they're arriving in the winter. They don't have clothing. They've just gotten access to housing. They've left their whole family behind. Grandparents often play a really important role. And so knowing all of this is part of that assessment. So wheeling back into dynamic assessment, could you tell us a little bit more about you started to tell, that you'll start with some static assessment. You may send the questionnaire to parents. You may collaborate with parents in different respects, depending on what it is that you need or what information you're going to get. You might do some static tests in their home language and in the majority language. Then how do you then dive into your dynamic assessment? Like, do you have a process? Is it a case by case? You said you don't really do the test, teach, retest, and you're doing more of an ecological type of assessment. So where do we go from those two pieces? What's next?
So once I gather all of my data, because for me, dynamic assessment, that is what it is, the holistic gathering data from every source I can, from the parents, from the teacher, from everyone involved, looking at their medical records, their social cultural history, the
Yeah.
static testing in both languages, if that's applicable, the language sample, the speech sample, so it's a whole full thing. And then I put it together and pretty much wrap it in a nice bow. What are the patterns that we're seeing? The patterns that I see in the language sample, are those the same patterns that I'm seeing in the standardized test? So for
Right.
example, irregular plural verbs, or regular verbs, for example, are they putting ed in natural speech, or are they not doing it in the standardized test, for
Right.
example? So if I'm seeing inconsistencies there, if they are a bit stronger with the language sample, and if that's what I go over to the parents. Okay, well, what are the parents saying about their speech? Are the parents really having any concerns, or are they kind of 50-50 about it? And if the parent are saying we don't have any concerns with their speech, that's almost when, I'll look at the teachers. Some teachers just kind of have that radar, they're like, well, they're
Yeah.
not making any progress in my class, so it must be a speech problem.
Yeah.
But really, no, let's try other options. Maybe it's more so just academic. Maybe they just need some more academic interventions. It's not necessarily a speech issue. So
Right.
that would be the next step for me. It's just figuring out, where is the breakdown? Is there a breakdown? And
Mhm.
how can this come together to say, yes, they qualify, or no, they don't qualify? So in my mind, I'm a very visual person. So that's how I came up with the 1, 2, 3, so I can organize my thoughts. But in my mind, I'm picturing, those magazines who have those quizzes that's like, yes,
Yeah.
no. And then that's what I'm picturing in my mind. And so if it is all boiling down to no, then in Oklahoma, the system requires us to talk about the educational strengths, the educational needs, which also includes the recommendation.
Yeah.
If they do qualify, of course, we talk about the eligibility determination, how it will impact them in the educational environment. And then we also talk about the educational strengths as well. We call that the present levels. I don't know if you did, if it's the same in Canada?
Well, we'll talk about, functionally what, like, if I'm doing a dynamic assessment, I'll talk functionally about what is helping them and what kind of supports were helping them in my assessment, to then use those supports maybe in the classroom. Some supports would be maybe more applicable to the family, whereas others will be more applicable within the classroom in a more universal teaching setting. And then if the child does receive one-on-one speech therapy after, we'll use those types of supports as well. So yeah, it's more like, how does the child function? We have to describe the functional impacts. So I'll often talk about what they are able to do, what they're able to do with support, the level of support that they need, and then what sometimes parents will come and tell us things like, and I'm thinking more about preschool kids here for an example,
Mm-hmm.
but if parents are telling me, well, my kid is not able to tell me about their day or tell me a story, well, this is kind of a more complex language function. Maybe I have to help them break it down, because maybe they're not there yet. So we're going to break it down and see what it is they need to get there. So I won't say that they can't do that. I'm just going to say that they're not there yet. And this is what we need to work on to help target what the parents or the teacher is mentioning, that is where the breakdown, I guess, is happening, or where the difficulties are occurring on a daily basis functionally, how the functional impacts are manifesting in this child's day to day.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yes.
answer your
And
question? Yeah.
I think it does. And that is very similar. How is this impacting them in the academic environment? How can this put them at risk for having challenges in the
Yes.
academic environment? And then also, for me, it's also important how it's manifesting at home, and
Yeah.
how they're communicating, with their families. Just to quickly go back to the standardized test. Now, even though I might report the standardized score, and that's only because specifically in Oklahoma, we have to.
Right.
Now in Texas, I was able to actually just not, and just put like the strengths and the areas of concerns that I noticed. But here in Oklahoma, I might report it, but I'll also say, this should be taken with caution, since English isn't their first language. So that's just another tidbit that I would add, is just being thorough in that sense. So like, if anything with dynamic assessment, the biggest thing I will say, do the language assessment. I don't know if it's just the caseload caps here, or the lack thereof. but it's something that I do. I've done a poll on Instagram and asked speech pathologists if they do language sample, if they feel comfortable doing language samples. And many have said no. And the reason why is because they don't feel competent enough to do it. It's too
Okay.
time consuming. And then I'm also thinking, there is technology and there's like that technology curve. So there's the SALT software that I don't use either. I actually use my podcast transcription software to just transcribe it for me. But that's because I'm used to it and I know how to use it. But the ones that we were taught, for example, in grad school, I know for myself, we were taught it, but not enough for me to feel exactly. Not enough
I
for me to feel
agree.
super confident.
So I was trained in SALT as well. And then I took another training later on after because I graduated in 2011. So I took another training later on. And when I got back to that training, I thought, well, this is really complicated and long for not for nothing, but it's really
Right.
long to do it this way. But it's funny you mentioned that because I wanted to kind of ask you about what you think of the advent of AI and how this can be used in the field. Because right now, here in Quebec, there's a colleague that I know of. He developed with a developer, he came up with what they called her Natalie AI. They named her Natalie,
Mm.
and she's an AI bot meant to be like an SLP assistant, been fed and trained for SLP. So she's been just fed SLP information, reports, assessment, intervention. So right now, I've been exploring with Natalie, and what I've been able to do, believe it or not, is take an audio recording, plug it into Natalie. I upload the audio recording, and she transcribes it for me into a document. It becomes this big blob in any language.
Uh-huh.
So I've done it I've had young children speaking in Arabic. I've had some children speaking in Spanish. I've had Tagalog for some Filipino families that I was working with. And it's transcribing it for me. And then I'm asking Natalie, so now it's not fine-tuned yet where the analysis is coming into play, because if it's transcribed in Arabic or in Tagalog, I can't read it. It's transcribing the sounds, right? Phonetically.
Right.
So I think this is somewhere we can be going. We need to explore more the use of AI in order to become more efficient. Soap notes right now, super easy. I'm looking at my phone right now because it's sitting next to me, but you just start your recording. You have to make sure you erase it after, of course, for confidentiality purposes, but you start your audio recording. You have to just start getting used to thinking out loud. So, if you have a parent in your session, I don't know about you, but I would normally tell the parent what we're doing, invite the parents to try, ask the parents. So kind of also talking about what you see and observe your analysis, saying it out loud. Okay, that one was good, but I had to give you this type of support. Oh, that one, and then maybe after even saying, okay, the child got like 15 out of 20 trials correctly, 4 of them needed support and 1 he didn't get at all. And then you plug that in, it transcribes it, then you put in this text transcription, and then you ask her to create your soap note, and it is compliant with our orders, our professional orders, what they require in the file. So I'm
Mind blown.
mind blown,
Amazing.
because after I can also ask Natalie to create a summary in any language that I can send to a parent if I want to summarize the session, or if I want to send homework, I can type it. I can type strategies that we discussed, or honestly, the possibilities are endless. So I'm just curious, what do you think about that? You're talking about SALT software, but what about AI?
I love AI personally. I have used AI this year for speech therapy sessions. It's amazing. Really, it's amazing for speech therapy sessions, but we're talking about assessment. So
Yeah.
I will even say, for example, like if I feel like a summary isn't strong enough, or I'm like, there's words I'm missing, there's something I'm missing that's not making my point really hit home.
Yeah.
I'll ask AI to do it for me. I'll say, can you talk, this is what the kid is showing up with. Can you
Yeah.
talk about how this can impact him in his academic setting? And these are his
Yes.
teacher's concerns. And then I'll do it. And it's amazing. Now, the thing with AI, at least I use Gemini. First, I was using ChatGPT, which I also like, but Gemini AI, I notice sounds a little less robotic. Is AI tries to give us kind of flowery language, almost like you're sending newsletter, or like it's very copywriter. So Natalie might be better for a speech pathologist because it might actually just be more technical.
Yes, because she's trained,
Yeah.
she's been fed information that is by speech pathologists for speech pathologists, and they're continuously. So I think it was launched in the fall of 2023, and I officially heard word of it around December. I went and I subscribed. I canceled my other AI account because Natalie is really for SLP. So there's like a report generator, there's a knowledge base I've used, and again, you have like audio to text. You can even create audio files. Let's say you want to work on speech sounds. You can have her create an audio file of a man or a woman or a child. You have different voices you can select from saying a text out loud. So I've had Natalie write stories for me for a fifth grader containing the S sound in different word positions using Marvel characters. Okay, so like the more specific you get on your prompt, the better the outcome. And you can tell how many characters you want it to be, how long, if you want it to be funny, serious, dramatic, professional, laid, like a more relaxed tone. So there's, I don't know, for me, I'm just like the
I love
possibilities
it.
are
I'm
endless.
sold. I'm sold on it, you know, because I'm thinking about Gemini AI, for example, and just like what you said, you're able, for example, I'll ask the child, what are you learning in science? And what's been so disappointing this year is they're like, I don't know. Oh my gosh, tell me what you're learning. I don't know what we're learning. But, you know, so I did happen to find out they were learning about the solar system and the phases of the moon. So I asked Gemini, please create a short story, because of course they'll give you a whole novel if you don't. Please create a short story about the phases of the moon, make it funny and heartwarming. This is also the child's goals. Please create questions that targets their ability to find key details in the story and create the main idea. And it'll 10 seconds come up with it, and it's a really nice and compelling story. And I'm like, okay, give me the answers, actually. Like, what are the possible answers to this? You know, so I think that if more SLPs knew about Natalie specifically and know that it's possible for our time to be cut in half, then we would probably actually have a lot more culture responsive assessment.
Yeah, I agree. And even sending, because I guess some of the families you're working with, they do at least speak some English. Is that so? We may have a lot of families that come and don't speak French yet or speak very little French. And so it's hard to communicate. And this is where, and we may not have time to talk about interpreters today, maybe another time.
No, and we didn't get to talk about interpreters today. Yeah. And obviously interpreters are important for this process as well.
So important. But I think that if we don't have access, there are, like you said, it's okay to have humility and say, okay, I don't know, but I'm going to go and find out. And then I think we can complement these, you know, fill these gaps a little bit with AI can be a good tool to use. AI can give us insights on differences between the two languages. If I say, you know, I have a French-speaking child from France and they've arrived and now we have French from Quebec, it's very different. Can you tell me what are some of the grammatical differences, or maybe they're not grammatical, but vocabulary? There'll be some very different vocabulary words. I imagine Spanish, you were trained in, you said Guatemalan Spanish versus I've had families from Mexico, from Venezuela, from Colombia, all different. So Natalie can give you information about if you're not able to find Spanish, English, Spanish, French. There are like a lot of resources, but other languages, I mean, I don't know about you, but we have like First Nations that are speaking all these different languages. And I have a lot of African families that come from many different African countries, and they'll tell me, oh, there's like 25 languages in my country. And I'm like, wonderful. Okay, so how do I go get information on this language, right? So I think AI is definitely going to be able to lessen our workloads in many different kinds of ways, give us quicker access to information that we may need. Of course, we have to use our clinical judgment and be careful about that. But I'm looking at the time and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's almost already 1 full hour. And I just have so many more questions to ask you.
I do want to say this one thing. I would actually be so remiss if I do not say this. Another part about my dynamic assessment, or the holistic assessment approach, is contrastive analysis. So I'm very thankful that you brought up your African families, because I had a student who it wasn't Igbo. There's a specific language that her family spoke. And she, you know, her teacher came to us the year after the lockdowns happened and said, she's having all these different sound substitutions. And when I did and then of course the parents, those are normally the parents who I have in my mind who are like, I don't notice any issue with my child, but sure, test away, fine. And so so I didn't test in the home language. I tested
no, but the parents had no concerns in the home language. Sorry,
in the home language. And so it was where the father spoke fluent English, the mother didn't speak English much. But of course, if you're with your parents, and she was in first grade, so if you're in kindergarten at that time with your parents still learning language skills, of course you're going to come to school with those different sound substitutions and errors. And so what I did was I had to go and search, and this is before I found out that ASHA actually have a phonemic inventory chart. I just found that out this year because I was looking on Google Scholar for the different, but that's an option. You can look up the different dialectal features and just compare them. And so I found that they didn't have certain sounds in their language that we had in English. And so that's what I'm like, no, teacher, she simply does not qualify. And now that we're at the end of the year, you're noticing that her test scores are going up. That's because she's getting more acclimated to this environment.
Right. I love that you said that. So yeah, there is ASHA, and there are actually so many different resources. I'm just trying to pull up here. Another really good resource is the Multilingual Children's Speech. Oh wait, I was about to close our window by accident. I'm like, no, don't do that. We're still in our live. It's called Multilingual Children's Speech, and it's from Alberta. Oh, Charles Sturt University. And so they have tons of multilingual information in terms of speech acquisition. They have speech acquisition studies for tons of different languages. They have the intelligibility and context scale, which is a short questionnaire that we can send the parents. And it's available in many different languages if the parents don't speak English or French in our case here. So they have different publications, and then they have, for certain languages, you can also click pertinent information for SLPs about the languages and the differences, or, have a contrastive analysis of the language. So for example, I'm looking here on the website and they have like Arabic. You can click and access the IPA chart, and then it says info for SLPs in the next row. And there is a PDF available for Arabic where there'll be maybe some cultural and linguistic, even morphological information that's mentioned. And then it tells you if there's speech tests available as well in that language. Not that I'd be able to necessarily administer that, but yeah, there's a lot of information on the Charles Sturt University website as well as ASHA. And my last go-to if I'm stuck, well, AI now, I definitely go and ask AI to give me, and we can ask AI to give us phonetic inventories for different languages, but also, why is my mind, what do you call it? Oh my gosh, I'm having like word finding difficulties right now.
And that happens to me all the time.
What's that website that everyone can post? It's Wikipedia. There you go.
Okay.
So Wikipedia, even though you or me, like anyone can create a page on Wikipedia, you can verify what the sources are of the page that was created on Wikipedia. But often they'll have phonological or phonetic information about many different languages, and even some cultural information if we need to go and dig and get some more information there. So that's kind of my last resort, but it could be good information. And I just wanted to wrap up on this last thing that I wanted to ask you. You talk about cultural compatibility. Did I say that correctly? Did you coin this term? And can you just wrap it up and tell us about that?
No. Well, yes, I can, of course. No, I did not coin the term. I wish I could say I coined the term, and it's amazing because our colleagues are like, yes, she coined this. And I'm like, please, I didn't. I wish I were that cool. But no, it's actually... Her name is Kempina Bakoti. She's actually from the nursing industry who coined the term. And then Dr. Kiyomi Gregory, I actually looked up on the Informed SLP, and she had an article talking about cultural compatibility. And so that's when I dug deeper and created a whole presentation. And my research really for the past 2 years has been centered around that. And ultimately what cultural compatibility is, it's the marriage between cultural humility and cultural competency. And so I think that, of course, we're taught the separation of the two, but they describe it as the synergistic process of learning and being. So just like today, how we mentioned I'll just use my Cuban client, for example, just asking them, is this how you would say this in your language? So that's me using the cultural humility piece, the cultural competency piece. First of all, the fact that I had that knowledge to even just ask them. And then my competency is learning how to use that in treatment effectively to get our treatment outcomes done and accomplished. So that's the marriage. And I think that if we thought about it more like that, on top of thinking about how to best, what's the word I'm looking for? Because the source is Axner 2022, 8 ways to build relationships with multicultural populations and groups.
Yeah.
And yeah, so have you heard of that?
No, but I'm writing it down.
Yes, yeah. 8 ways to build relationships with multicultural groups. And I think that is the first step. And if we can make that part of our learning and being process, like embodying that clinician who is so passionate and always just wants to learn more about everybody who we come into contact with, then it will actually be easier to get over those humps, like those psychological humps of, I don't know what I'm doing, so I don't, I think that if we can really just embody that person who really just loves culture, then we can do a lot of changes in our industry.
I love that. I'm definitely going to go and find this article. Who was the author you said?
Axner. What I can do, I actually do have like a resource. It's a handout that I created for Astra,
Yes,
and
I've
I can
seen it.
send that your way. You saw? Oh, great. Yeah, so I have all the sources on there also.
Oh, beautiful. Okay, if you have that, because what I'm going to do is that when I reshare this beautiful live that we've done, because it's a little bit choppy on Facebook as we're about to wrap up, I'm going to be resharing
Okay.
it on YouTube, and I'll add the links underneath so that people who are listening can access the original article and your resources. So can you just tell us before we leave off where we can find you, listen to you, subscribe, get maybe some of these resources you've been talking about?
Yes, so I am very active on Pediatric Speech Sister on Instagram. I also do have the podcast, the Pediatric Speech Sister Show, which is on Apple and Spotify.
Which is a must listen.
And thank you so much. Also, really thank you. Also on YouTube, that's where I have my interviews, and I like to talk about all things cultural responsiveness. I'm not going to necessarily step away from speech pathology on the show because it's called Pediatric Speech Sister, but I do want to go to some sort of rebrand where I really dig deep into more critical issues like human rights and social justice and everything. So if that's your jam, if you want to learn more about that and how we can use that information to be better clinicians, then yes, please feel free to reach out to me. And I'm also on LinkedIn.
Beautiful. Thank you. I think we can all use more of that considering all the atrocities happening in the world. I think we can all use and learn to how can we work together for just to be better in our day-to-day, but hopefully bring about a better world in our generation and the next ones to come. So thank you so much for all this breadth of information that you had to share with us, the resources. I can't wait to go and listen to more of your podcasts. They've been really
thank you,
eye-opening and helpful, especially if you want to develop more of these best practices with the families that we're working with and be better with our colleagues and better support everyone around us. And so thanks again for your precious time. We're going to